Um, Now, Gareth seemed to give a bit of hype to what I was going to say at the start. Don't believe the hype. I've really struggled with this. I think maybe because it's such a vast topic, there is so much you could say. And actually, have you noticed there's been a lot more recently in the news, just in the consciousness of our nation, I think about the effects of social media recently. There are so many angles that could have been taken. So, I mean, I just started to jot down a list. I mean, we could talk about possible addiction to social media, use of time, kind of profitable ways we could use time on social media or time wasting. There are lots of questions about whether intensive use of social media affects your empathy. Did anyone see, it was a while back now, but there was a picture, someone had taken a selfie of themselves with someone who'd been in a train accident in the background, and they were catching the victim or the patient and themselves kind of in the foreground. And then someone took a picture of that, and that went viral because of the shocking lack of empathy. Now, I mean, anyway, there's lots of questions around that. There's questions about the impact more generally on our brain, on kind of how whether our attention span is affected by this, whether we are adapted to be better at multitasking or unitasking or whatever. Exposure, especially maybe as a Christian thinking about this, to unhelpful content that you shouldn't, as a follower of Jesus, be looking at. There's the question about the echo chamber effect, and we've already thought maybe a little bit about that with the truthfulness of news, and particularly thinking of Twitter. You know, kind of people talk about the people that they follow who may have very similar views to them that reinforce the views that they already have and don't challenge the views that ought to be challenged. There's issues often talked about in schools about cyberbullying and the way that just extends some of the unhelpful behavior that happens in schools to the home. Questions about privacy, questions about your data, questions about how it's used, questions about how it's monetized or how you're marketed at without your consent, those sorts of issues. But also really great things, and it's really good to hear the balance in what Chippo and Anika shared with us. The ways that we can connect with people in different parts of the world, that friendships that would have probably dried up, or family relationships that would have been much colder if we hadn't have had the opportunity to keep communicating with each other. Opportunities for the gospel. I mean, maybe some of you are here this morning. I can't really share the details of it, but a friend shared with us of the remarkable way that he's able to use apps on iOS devices to reach people with the gospel in places where it would be impossible, or virtually impossible otherwise. So there are pros and there are cons. Now, I'm barely going to touch on any of that. So if you want to talk about any of that, then bring it up in the Q&A. What I decided to do this evening is actually just home in on one thing that Jesus teaches, and then try to relate that to this topic. I thought I'll try and do one thing well, rather than multitasking and being on 100 different things at once. I'll try and focus on one thing and see how we go with that. So I'm going to pray for us, and then we're going to turn to Matthew chapter 5. So let's pray. Lord, thank you for the way that you place us in this world to be salt and light, to be a good, godly influence, and to point people to your Son, Jesus. And help us now to think about this topic of social media in light of one of the things that he said. Open our eyes and challenge us where we need to be challenged. Lord, help us to see how we can be like Christ to this world, even in the way that we present ourselves online. Amen. So, if you have a Bible with you, open up to Acts. We're in Acts in the mornings. I'm just on autopilot. Matthew chapter 5. And we're going to start reading at verse 33. This might seem a bit weird why I've chosen this to begin with, but hopefully as we start to make some progress, you'll see where this connects with the topic we're looking at. So Matthew chapter 5, verse 33. Jesus says, "Again, you have heard that it was said to the people long ago, 'Do not break your oath, but fulfill to the Lord the oaths you have made.' But I tell you, do not swear an oath at all, either by heaven, for it is God's throne, or by the earth, for it is his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. And do not swear by your head, for you cannot make even one hair white or black. All you need to say is simply yes or no. Anything beyond this comes from the evil one." Okay, now that may seem like a passage out of left field to you if you're wondering what it's got to do with social media. And actually, it seems like an odd passage anyway, doesn't it? Of all the things that Jesus could tell people to do, why is he focusing on making oaths or making vows? It seems like a kind of just a straightforward blanket prohibition, doesn't it? Don't do that. But I don't think that's really the target that Jesus is aiming for in this passage. For one thing, you look at the early church, people like Paul, and they took oaths quite often, actually. Look at Jesus. At the end of this same gospel, as Matthew tells it, he speaks under oath when he's at his trial. And when you look at the wider Bible in the Old Testament, in the book of Hebrews, actually, in the New Testament, God is said himself to have taken an oath. So what is Jesus targeting here? What is it that he's criticizing? I think what it is the way that people can take something like an oath and they can distort it to create some space where they can mislead somebody. Let me just illustrate that to you by turning to a passage a bit later in the gospel. In Matthew 23, Jesus is talking to the Pharisees. And these Pharisees are the religious leaders of the day, and Jesus is criticizing all kinds of areas of hypocrisy in their life. And in verse 16 of chapter 23, he says this: "Woe to you, blind guides! You say, if anyone swears by the temple, it means nothing. But anyone who swears by the gold of the temple is bound by that oath. You blind fools." And Jesus gives a bunch of other examples of different kinds of oaths that people might swear. People were into swearing oaths back in the first century. And there were different things you could swear by: your head, or Jerusalem, or the gold in the temple, or the altar, or whatever. Loads of different options available to you. But do you see what was there in chapter 23? That if you swear this oath, it kind of means something. Swear that oath, it means nothing at all. This one is binding. You've got to do what you've said. This one isn't. You can say what you like. It's this kind of gradation of truth, which is the scary thing that Jesus is putting his finger on here. That sometimes things are true and other times things aren't. Sometimes things are kind of somewhere in the middle, and there's all this gray that shouldn't exist in the way that we communicate. And so when we turn back to Matthew 5 and look at what Jesus is criticizing here, I think Jesus is challenging the idea that the way that you say something should have anything to do at all with how truthful it should be. He's saying that the context in which you say something has absolutely nothing to do with whether it should be truthful or not. And so whether you use an oath or not, it really doesn't matter. What Jesus brings us to at the end of the passage in verse 37 is this straightforward, plain-speaking, transparent honesty, doesn't he? He says there that the way that you, if you're going to be my follower, should talk is yes or no. A simple yes or no. It's about being a kind of wholehearted person, that you mean what you say and you say what you mean, that what you are on the inside is reflected in the way that you communicate with other people. A simple yes or a simple no. And look at where Jesus takes it finally in the last little bit of verse 37. He says, anything beyond this comes from the evil one. Anything beyond the plain truth of the situation comes from the evil one. I mean, those are strong words from Jesus, aren't they? Really strong words. And chiming in with some of the stuff that Chippo and Anika were bringing up there. I mean, think about the kind of oath-taking culture. Try and imagine it. I know it's not our culture, but imagine what that might be like. When would someone just step a little bit beyond the truth in the oaths that they're making? Maybe they want to give a different impression of themselves. Maybe they are a certain way, but they take an oath just to insist to people that they are more virtuous, or they're telling the truth when they're not. Or maybe they're retelling what happened in a situation, and they kind of frame it in a slightly different way. They just massage the truth a little bit, and they take an oath to insist that that is really the way it was, when perhaps it wasn't. They just take a step or two beyond a simple yes or no. And Jesus says that is of the evil one. Now, as I said, our culture isn't an oath-taking culture. Maybe you've given evidence in court and you've had to take an oath, or some of us here will have said vows on a wedding day, and so we've made kind of an oath then. But apart from that, I mean, this week, have you made an oath? Probably not. It's not really what we do these days. But what Jesus seems to be pointing to here is that there is a deeper problem, something really at the heart of what it means to be a fallen human being, that we have this urge to mislead people, that we just have this propensity towards deceit. And that's not a nice thing to be confronted with, but I think it is a reality of what it means to be a fallen human being. that in all kinds of ways, when we communicate with one another, it can be very easy to mislead people about ourselves, about others, about situations. And what Jesus seems to be putting his finger on here in the first century is that something as simple as an oath, something potentially good like an oath, actually these oaths that people would swear, they kind of come out of the Old Testament, out of the Torah. They were given by God to ensure truthfulness, to make sure that people meant what they said and felt the full weight of the words that they used. But just as I was saying at the start, that urge to mislead, it distorts something as potentially good as an oath. And it creates some space there to deceive. And if that is what we're kind of wired to do, and we maybe struggle with, but that urge is strong, then throughout all kinds of generations, people have found different conventions that people do, here taking oaths, different technology that becomes available to us to act these things out, to give a megaphone to the ways that we want to mislead one another. And I think there's a real temptation for us in our day and age, with the incredible technology at our disposal, to use social media in that way. I mean, just hearing some of the things that have been shared already, there is that temptation, isn't there? And so to be a follower of Jesus, to tap into the wisdom here of Jesus, what does that look like in our day and age? Well, I think one of the things which has actually already been said, and I'm really pleased that what I've been thinking about and kind of cogitating on this week is agreed with by other people. That really reassures me. But one of the things that I think is absolutely super wise, if we listen to what Jesus is saying here, is that when you're online and you see what someone posts, the pictures, the views, the quotes, the things that are there on their wall, to realize what Jesus is saying here is to realize that the person that has been posted there probably doesn't exist, or at least not in a fully formed, real way, the way that it's presented. Like Chippo was saying there, when someone posts a picture on Instagram, that is not the full picture of them. That is a snapshot, isn't it? That is carefully edited highlights of a person's life. And you've probably heard this before, but it's the kind of thing we need to hear again and again and again. That when they're sort of scrolling through Facebook and you come across someone who you haven't seen for a little while, and you see how wonderful their life is, how they always look just so well made up and perfectly put together. They're a beautiful person. Their friends are funny and gorgeous and amazing, and their life is brilliant, and their food is so healthy, and their holidays are so nice, and their car is incredible. Yeah, everything. You can begin to just go insane with the comparison game, can't you? It can eat you up inside. And of course, the remedy to this is just to realize that probably isn't the real them. Just like Chippo was saying to us earlier, you don't know their struggles. You don't know what they're going through. You don't know what the other half or the other 95% of their life looks like. I mean, when people post things online, who posts when they put the bins out, or when they have a normal day at work, or when they're flossing their teeth or applying deodorant? Or people don't post these things because that's the side of life that is real for all of us. But we're only conscious of those things in our own lives, aren't we? You see 100% of yourself, 100% of your life, and you see a fraction of that in other people. So the temptation to compare yourself and to be driven insane with that comparison is large. Let's turn this around and think about what it might mean for us, the way that we behave online, the way that we communicate ourselves. And of course, the obvious thing to think about is, are we doing what Jesus talks about here when he's speaking about oaths? Do we communicate in a way that is honest, transparent, truthful, real? And I'm not saying here that we kind of overshare, that we share everything. Actually, I advise you don't do that. And I think there's probably going to be a lot in the decades to come when people of my generation and generations below will really regret things that we have shared. So don't feel like you need to share lots. And I'm not suggesting that at all. But what I am suggesting is that just imagine someone only knew you from your own online presence. And then they meet you face to face. And you sit down, you have a conversation, or they come to your house, or they meet your family or your friends. Would they recognize you? You know, from what you share on Instagram and your Facebook and on Twitter, would you have similar views? Would you look as nice as you look all the time on social media? Would you eat the same kind of food? Would you have the same dynamic, exciting, creative job as you have kind of in reality, day to day? Or would they meet someone that looks nothing like the person that you've projected? Would they find someone who actually is just a kind of shrunken version of this puffed up, exaggerated version that you portray to the world around you? I've been thinking about this quite a bit actually this week, because last week, if you were here in the morning, we were talking about Ananias and Sapphira, and this was their problem too. Ananias and Sapphira, you might know the story, but they give quite a bit of money to the church, but they keep some back, and they pretend that they've given everything when actually they've only given most or some. And people misunderstand sometimes the story and assume that it's about not giving everything to God, when really it's about making yourself out to be something that you're not. They pretended to be 100% generous when actually they were maybe 80 or 90% generous. They were tricking people, fooling them with the way that they presented themselves. And I was thinking there's so much crossover between this topic we're looking at this evening and that story bedded in the book of Acts there. And if that was happening today, you know actually there'd be one difference. If Acts 5 was in the 21st century, when Peter is there with the other apostles and Ananias brings the gift and he presents it before the apostles' feet. The one thing that would be different, they'd have to add a verse in, because if this was happening today, he'd lean in for a selfie, wouldn't he? Do you think? He'd lean in for a selfie, get a little snap of him and Peter, there'd be a little hashtag, something about how great these guys are. He's humbled to share with them, some sort of humble bragging about actually how wonderful he is, and it's amazing to be able to donate so much to this worthy cause, love what the guys are doing in Jerusalem, hashtag Jesus or whatever. It would be the most cringy thing, but that is the kind of stuff that we get into these days, isn't it? Ananias using social media is believable because actually it's just an extension of what's going on in his heart. This isn't a new thing. Kind of what Jesus is raging against in chapter 5 of Matthew, with people claiming to be something in an oath that they take when they're not really that. It's just exactly the same as we might do online through our social media today. And so there's nothing really new here. This is just the human heart at work. And so the question is, well, how can we get past this? And we'll come on to that in a minute. I just want to point out a couple of reasons why this is so important. Why do we need to be honest like this? I think one of the reasons is for other people. One of the reasons is for other people, because if you know that experience of scrolling through on your phone or whatever and just feeling a sense of inadequacy as you look at somebody else and you see their life and you see how fantastic they are, maybe how beautiful they are, how rich they are, how successful they are, how kind of they take risks and have adventures every single day of the week, or whatever it is, how spiritual they are, and you just feel inadequate and jealous of that person as you scroll through. You know, there's a possibility if you put out there a hyped up, inflated version of yourself, there might be someone somewhere in the world scrolling through, looking at you, and feeling just as miserable about themselves. Now, that may give you some comfort that you can bring misery into somebody else's life and share it around a bit, but it shouldn't, should it? If we are creating these versions of ourselves that really bear no close resemblance to reality, we're just feeding the beast of comparison, aren't we? We're being a part of that problem, which is, as we've been thinking about, probably a blight on younger generations, of comparison, of feeling bad about yourself, of feeling that you don't match up, that you're not as good as her or him or whoever else. So the first reason why we need to really watch the way that we present ourselves online is to guard against being a part of the problem, for the good of other people who are going to be consuming the content that we put out there. But the second reason is for ourselves. I mean, have you ever tried to keep a mask up? Tried to be consistently for a while something that you're not? It's a very tiring thing, isn't it? It can be exhausting. And often I think we feel the urge to do it. I know that urge when you want to appear maybe more intelligent or intellectual than you really are. Or you want to give the impression on social media that you are more beautiful than you really are. And so every picture needs to be taken from a certain angle. And you work so hard to figure out your wardrobe even for what you're going to go out and just in case somebody is going to take a photo of you and it's going to end up on Instagram. And you want your presence on there to be perfectly curated, to present you in exactly the right way. I mean, we joked about Ananias and Sapphira, but I think often in Christian circles, this has been an effect we've seen, that there is that deep urge, that deep longing amongst a lot of Christians to look spiritual. I mean, when was it before social media when you come to church for kind of a photo op, or you go to a Christian conference and you would tweet about it, or you do your Bible reading in the morning and you'd post something? just to kind of give the impression. Now, maybe there's people who are just genuinely wanting to share something good that God has shared with them. And there probably is a lot of that out there. But I dare say, often when people are sharing these things, it's because they want to seem just a bit more spiritual. We can listen to Jesus just a few verses later when he says, "Be careful not to practice your righteousness in front of others to be seen by them." And there's that urge, isn't there, in whatever area of our life, that we're doing things to be seen by other people. And we get into that kind of torturous habit of just doing it constantly, trying to keep up with this person that we've created that isn't really a close reflection of the reality. And we're terrified that people will see us for who we really are. And so we perpetuate the myth of the intellectual, the beautiful, the cultural, the hipster, the spiritual, whatever it is that we want to put out there, that we can never quite attain to. So how do we get past this? What is the answer to this urge that all of us feel to make ourselves out to be something that we're not? To put out there something that goes way beyond yes and no and honesty into the realm of the evil one. Well, I think a cornerstone of Jesus' teaching here on the Sermon on the Mount is so simple and so beautiful. It is that we have a Father in heaven who loves us. This is kind of paradigm shifting for Jesus, isn't it? As he teaches, this is what he brings that is so different, that our Father in heaven loves us, that he accepts us, that he knows us perfectly, that he sees behind your Facebook wall, behind your Twitter stream, behind your Instagram, to the real you. And yet he still welcomes you in. And yet he still loves you. He knows all your stupidity and the silly things you think and the mistakes you've made. He knows what you look like when you're flossing your teeth and applying deodorant and putting the bins out. He knows that your job is not as exciting as you make out, or that your friends are not as dynamic and fun as you make out. He knows the reality of your life, the drudgery of your life, the normality of your life, but he loves you and he accepts you and he welcomes you. You are a joy to him. And I think this is the game changer for a Christian. This is what has the power to move us from a place where we are consumed by what other people think about us and obsessed with these ways that we can present ourselves very powerfully to the people who are watching. It can move us from there to a place where we are free to be ourselves so much more. Free to be open and honest about the real us. To post me, unfiltered, just the way I am. Because God, my Father, loves me. And God, your Father, if you're a Christian this evening, has poured out his love into your life. I mean, you start reading through the rest of the New Testament, you see just how deeply the Father loves you. And when we start to clock that, I think it really does begin to change the way that we think about other people and their appreciation of us. If God loves us like that, we don't need to go chasing after the approval of other people. I'm going to wind up now, really, before we have a chance to have some questions, because I haven't touched on half the things you probably want to know about. But just one little afterthought, actually, because as Gareth said, some of you will be so disinterested in this topic that you just it may have seemed completely irrelevant to you. But I'd just like us to think as we stop about whether this is really just a social media issue. I mean, can we really say that it's only on Instagram and Facebook and Snapchat and wherever else that we try and make ourselves out to be something that we're not? That we try and go beyond the real us to present a slightly more polished us? I mean, whether it is in the oath-taking of the first century or the social media of the 21st century, or just the stress and the obsession over a well-put-together dinner party with a clean house and the right menu and your hair done nicely. We can obsess over presenting the right us, the better us, the us that we want to put out there. And it ties us up in knots, and it obsesses us with what other people think, when actually, if we really come to terms with how much God loves us, and just how much he is willing to give to bring us home into his family, we can be freed from that. and we can live a better way. And that means that when we begin to interact with other people, when we get online and when we are honest, normal, kind of transparent, real people online, we're doing what Jesus really puts right up at the top of the Sermon on the Mount. We're being salt and we're being light. We're being a transforming community in this world. We're being a community of contrast, not like everybody else, but living differently, following the way of Jesus because we're loved by the Father. So I'm going to pray for us now.